The story told in this video is quite unlike any other involving unidentified crime victims. The body was found immediately after the murder. The perpetrator was soon caught and punished. Many acquaintances of the victim were found, but to the police's surprise, this did not help identify the murdered person. In this unique case, even modern technologies and discovered relatives could not immediately shed light on the mystery of the victim's identity. However, nearly 31 years after the murder, the famous Eldorado Jane Doe was finally identified. Subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell to get notifications about new videos. Eldorado, Arkansas, July 10, 1991. A tall blonde woman went to meet her ex-boyfriend in room 121 of the Whitehall Motel. She didn't want to see him, but the man persuaded her by offering to pay for the conversation. Things quickly took a turn for the worse. The man started yelling at the woman. She wanted to leave, but he wouldn't let her go. An opportunity presented itself when a motel neighbor came to demand the return of his tapes. The woman asked the visitor to talk to her ex-boyfriend while she tried to leave the room. However, her former lover didn't allow her to do so. He hit her and dragged her back into the room by her hair, shouting insults. The neighbor, Roy Charles Menon, decided not to intervene and returned to his room. Behind the wall, he continued to hear the young people's screams, and soon a gunshot rang out, after which the noise subsided. The man arguing with the woman ran out of the room, got into his car, and drove away. His name was James Ralph McAlphine, nicknamed Ice. As for the woman he killed, her identity remained a mystery for almost 31 years. James McAlphine was soon caught by the police after a brief chase. He tried to deny his involvement in the woman's murder. The man admitted that he had argued with her and even hit her in front of a witness. However, he insisted that the woman had shot herself, taking her own life, but his version seemed strange and contradicted the witness's account. Finally, McAlphine was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree battery. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison, of which the killer served 13. During a search of the woman's personal belongings, an identification card was found under the name Cheryl Ann Wick. The police were able to locate this woman's family, who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Imagine their surprise when they met with a living and unharmed Cheryl. It turned out that the murdered woman had simply assumed someone else's identity. The real Wick speculated that her ID card was likely stolen when she worked as a dancer at the Party Time Club in Minneapolis. When shown photos of the victim, she didn't remember ever seeing the person. Law enforcement tried to get some information about the victim from her killer, but the convicted McAlphine refused to cooperate with the police unless his sentence was reduced. He claimed to know the true identity of his girlfriend. However, detectives were skeptical of his words because he was already a convicted criminal with a dark past and not a trustworthy person. From this point on, a long and difficult path began to identify the body of the woman who became known worldwide as Eldorado Jane Doe. Mercedes. The murdered woman was a tall, slender white female, standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing around 154 pounds. Her age was estimated to be between 18 and 30 years old. She was dressed in faded jeans with a black belt, a white t-shirt, and white tennis shoes with white ankle socks. And she wore 2 hair ties. On her right hand, she had a gold chain bracelet, 2 piercings in her left ear, and 3 in her right ear. She had freckles on her face, a mole under her breast, and 2 small scars, which looked like the results of injuries, one on her waist and another above her right eye. However, it was immediately clear that this description could fit tens of thousands of women in the United States to some extent. Law enforcement found out that the deceased had been dating James McAlphine for at least a year. However, about a month before the tragedy, she broke up with him and lived with her friend Andrea Cooksey. Andrea, like all her acquaintances, knew the deceased under the name Mercedes. Andrea tried to discourage her from meeting McAlphine, but unfortunately, her friend did not listen. The relationship between James and Mercedes was always unhealthy. The woman had sought medical help multiple times after being beaten. Her acquaintances also suspected that she was involved in prostitution, with McAlphine acting as her pimp. In Mercedes' room, a Bible, diary, and several restaurant menus from Virginia and Texas were found. In her entries, the woman mentioned a Tyrone, Gail, and her boyfriend, possibly McAlphine. Only a few pages of the diary were published, but it seems the entries were about a period when they were all together in Shreveport, Louisiana. Mercedes noted that Gail seemed to be unhappy with their company. Researchers who studied the diary pointed out that the author appeared more like an immature teenage girl, desperately seeking attention from even rough and detached men, like her boyfriend. Also, in the Bible found in the room, there were entries with the names of family members, with the last name Stroud. At that stage of the investigation, detectives could not determine who these people were and how they were connected to Mercedes. Law enforcement officials interviewed everyone who was somehow acquainted with the unknown murder victim. It turned out that the family of her boyfriend, McAlphine, had seen the girl on multiple occasions. McAlphine's niece, Danielle McAlphine, said that Mercedes always had a considerable amount of money with her and wore overly revealing outfits, leading the family to believe that the girl was working as a stripper. A Salvation Army volunteer from the city of Eldorado recalled how Mercedes told him about her life at 1100 Caddis Street in Dallas. It turned out that this address was a homeless shelter. The girl said that at the time, her daughter was taken away from her, and she could not get her child back because she was using a fictitious name. It was impossible to verify this information, as by the time the investigation took place, the records from that period at the shelter had been lost. It turned out that Mercedes told different versions of her life story to her acquaintances. For example, she told her friend Andrea Cooksey that she worked as a stripper, had 2 children who were raised by her mother, and her father was involved with the mafia. This inconsistency in her stories made it even more difficult for investigators to piece together her true identity and background. Mercedes also told others that she had been involved in bank robberies on the East Coast and participated in attacks on truck drivers with her African-American boyfriend, acting as a decoy. Furthermore, she claimed to be under the Witness Protection Program. As the investigation progressed, it became apparent that some of her stories might have contained elements of truth. Murder of Dwayne McCorkindale. On November 12, 1988, 27-year-old truck driver from Kansas City, Dwayne McCorkindale, was found shot dead near a phone booth in Chandler, Oklahoma. The bullet was fired from behind and hit him directly in the heart, causing him to die instantly. At the time, Dwayne was going to call his wife from a payphone at a rest area near the highway. The coins he was holding in his hand before he died were scattered around his body. McCorkindale was not only killed, but also robbed, which was likely the criminal's main objective. Questioning truck drivers who had communicated with McCorkindale via radio led the police to the theory that a trio in a brown Ford Pinto could have been involved in his murder. In the car were a white man and woman, as well as an African American. They tapped into the trucker's radio frequency and periodically cut them off on the road. Shortly before the incident, the woman from the group asked driver Ed Hatekamp for money and tried to get into his vehicle, but he refused her. He described the woman as looking terrible and heavily under the influence of drugs. The police were never able to find out who this group was, and even their composite sketches were not created. The murder of Dwayne McCorkindale remained unsolved. Investigators took notice of Eldorado Jane Doe in connection with this crime because, in addition to her stories, it took place in Oklahoma, and James McAlphine once mentioned during questioning that the so-called Mercedes had mentioned she was originally from this state. She also previously dated an African-American man named J.D., who forced her into prostitution at the age of 16. It was later determined that this man was Jeffrey Davis, a pimp from Dallas. However, all that was reliably known to the police about Jane Doe herself was that she had been arrested 3 times using the stolen identity of Cheryl Ann Wick, and once using another fabricated name. These incidents occurred on December 31, 1990, for prostitution at La Casita Motel in Dallas, Texas, January 26th, also in Dallas, February 8, 1991, for public indecency at the Carousel Motel in Garland, Texas, and less than 2 months before her own death for writing bad checks in Eldorado, Arkansas. In addition to the identity of Cheryl Ann Wick and the name Mercedes, the murder victim also used a multitude of other names, including Kelly Lee Carr, Kelly Carr, Shannon Wiley, Sharon Wiley, and Cheryl Kaufman. The case of Eldorado Jane Doe gained notoriety far beyond the borders of Arkansas. Even the famous Todd Matthews, Director of Case Management and Communications at the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, has commented on the case. He became well known after he single-handedly solved the mystery of the identity of the so-called Tent Girl in 1998, who had remained unidentified for 30 years. Full video about this story will be released on the channel in the near future. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Missing is worse than dead, because at least in death, you can bury the physical remains of a person, said Todd Matthews. The stories we deal with are sometimes more bizarre than one can even imagine. Unfortunately, when the public perceives that the unidentified might have been a criminal, the deceased does not receive enough attention, as people find it harder to perceive the deceased as a victim. In the case of Eldorado Jane Doe, questions fade away before they can lead to answers. The girl could have been a runaway, she could have been abducted, or she could have gone off track in life. James McAlphin. Investigators and journalists have repeatedly contacted the murderer, James McAlphin, to obtain information and learn who the mysterious Jane Doe really was. However, the criminal was evasive and tried to negotiate something in return. From the police, he wanted a reduced sentence, and from journalists, he simply wanted money. McAlphin corresponded with a HuffPost journalist, David Lohr, to whom he wrote that the identity of Eldorado Jane Doe was not a mystery to him, and that if Lohr paid him $4,000, he would reveal everything. The killer also wrote that if the name of the woman he murdered became known, law enforcement would gain the key to solving crimes related to her. After being released, James McAlphin continued to live in Eldorado, constantly ending up in jail for domestic violence and other crimes. Between 2008 and 2010, he even worked as a meat processor in Eldorado. However, his career in this field was interrupted by another arrest. McAlphin was last released from custody in 2020. In the end, attempts to establish the identity of Eldorado Jane Doe were unsuccessful. However, 28 years after the murder, in 2019, new technologies allowed for a breakthrough in the investigation. DNA analysis made it possible to find relatives of the unknown girl. Eldorado, Police Detective Lieutenant Kathy Phillips, spent 12 years working on Jane Doe's case, up until her retirement in 2019. Eventually, she managed to have the material related to the girl examined by specialists from the DNA Doe Project, and entered into the GED Match genealogical database, which has already helped solve hundreds of similar complex cases. Ultimately, the DNA match revealed a relationship between Eldorado Jane Doe and a married couple from Virginia. The couple was named Daniel Wood and Mamie Carter, and they had 9 children. As it turned out, they were the great-grandparents of a woman named Christina Tilford. In 2018, she took a DNA test out of curiosity to find any relatives, and certainly did not expect it to have such a continuation. Tilford admitted that she was shocked by the situation. It turned out that she was a second cousin of the murdered girl, but she did not know her at all. However, the woman noted that the unknown girl bore a physical resemblance to members of her family. The promising lead eventually led the investigation to a dead end. Kelly. On May 24, 2022, it was officially announced that the identity of Eldorado Jane Doe had been established. The family wished not to disclose the surname, but the first name of the deceased was revealed as Kelly, and the story of her life was shared. Kelly was born in 1968 in Virginia, so she was 23 years old at the time of her death. Her mother's name was Brenda, and she did not know her biological father, while her stepfather divorced her mother in 1972, by which time Kelly already had a sister. 2 months after the divorce, Brenda remarried a cruel man who treated everyone in the family poorly. This marriage lasted 7 years. Almost immediately after the divorce, Kelly's mother married another man who committed suicide a couple of months after the wedding. At this point, Kelly was 11 years old. There were rumors that her mother had a child in one of her marriages, but she did not want to raise the child and gave it to a neighboring family of farmers. After receiving the insurance payout from her last husband, Brenda went on vacation to Virginia Beach, leaving her daughters to live with their aunt in Charlottesville, Virginia. A year and a half later, the mother invited her daughters to move in with her. Kelly agreed, but her sister decided to stay with their aunt. After moving to Virginia Beach, Kelly dropped out of school and got a job as a salesperson at a beach souvenir shop. After each workday, she had to bring the revenue and goods home. One day, her mother stole both the money and the goods from her. In the summer of 1983, when Kelly was 15, one of her aunts came to visit, and they started living together. Everyone except Kelly's mother worked, so they had money for rent, but they still had to move frequently in search of more favorable options. The situation frustrated the aunt, and she returned to her house. A year and a half to 2 years later, while living with her mother in Florida, Kelly contacted her aunt and asked to stay with her. The girl was fed up with her mother's cocaine addiction, the endless parade of men, and abortions. However, Kelly didn't manage to live with her aunt for long, as the girl herself had developed a drug addiction by that point. Also, judging by the belongings Kelly brought with her, the aunt suspected that her niece was working as a stripper. That's why Kelly needed the stolen ID card of Cheryl Ann Wick, as the law prohibited her from engaging in such activities at her age. After moving to Texas, Kelly lived in Irving for some time, staying with the African-American Stroud family who took her in. Records of these people were found in the Bible that belonged to the girl. Later, she started a relationship with a good guy, and they even lived together. However, a calm life didn't suit Kelly's taste, so she left for Little Rock, Arkansas, where she lived for about 3 years. In 1989, the whole family reunited in Florida, but the daughters couldn't get along with their mother, so they went their separate ways. Kelly briefly stayed in Norfolk, Virginia, which was where the restaurant menus found in her room by investigators were from. Later, in Dallas, she met James McAlphin, and together they went to Eldorado, where Kelly was killed on July 10, 1991. Kelly's mother, Brenda, never learned about her daughter's death. In 1992, she went to visit her sister in Virginia, robbed her, and disappeared in an unknown direction. Brenda died in 2008. Although Kelly's last name has not been revealed, for most of the years of the investigation, the police believed that the unidentified woman was most likely named Kelly Lee Carr. It was assumed that at the time of her death, she was about 24 years old and had been involved in bank robberies on the East Coast. What do you think? Was Kelly involved in the murder of Dwayne McCorkindale?